Fragmentation has not happened because people were lazy or bored or didn't want to all come together. It is that in order to have a voice, you have to differentiate enough and that your voice is clearly heard and your needs are being clearly heard. And bringing everybody together without that differentiation was the same voices are heard over and over again. And the battles and the overpowering result is inevitable, that we were going to get a result that was built out of the largest voices always getting to speak.
Welcome back to the Midwifery Wisdom Podcast. This week, we're joined by a very special guest, Brynne Potter. Brynne is a renowned expert in the field of midwifery, with experience on multiple different midwifery boards, working with different midwifery organizations and programs in development, experience working with midwifery legislation in certain states, and most recently, working with the NARM board. In today's episode, Brynne shares how she believes birth and prenatal care have become more of a transaction than anything, and how it takes away from this truly sacred nature of birth. She shares some of her history working with legislation and midwifery laws, specifically around NARM, goes into a lot of detail on some of the programs that she has been involved in developing and working with for midwifery, including Maternity Neighborhood, Quilted Health, and of course, the future of NARM, some of the changes coming up, and some of the changes that she hopes to see. Let's dive into this truly brilliant conversation.
Welcome to the podcast, friend. We've been trying to do this for a while. Well, let's do intros because I was shocked to find out not everyone knows who you are. I feel like you're one of the icons in midwifery. But in case folks don't know, you're a founder and a CEO and all kinds of things. So tell us the history and don't leave anything out.
Okay, yeah. Well, how long do we have? Like how I came to be here in this moment. I started my path as a midwife when I was 19, actually, before I had kids. I worked for a women's health clinic and was just sort of involved in women's health and reproductive health, and felt like midwifery for me was sort of emblematic of empowerment. To me, that was like one and the same. It was sort of my first sort of approach. Like so many people, I read the books that were available, like Spiritual Midwifery and Hearts and Hands, and did reach out to Ina May, actually, because I went to a little regional MANA conference that had to have been like 1991. And it felt very, and was very closed and kind of a secret group that I wanted to be a part of, right? I will acknowledge now. The me then didn't realize she was fetishizing people, but the me now looks like, yeah, I worshipped and fetishized all the midwives and wanted to tap into something for myself.
Yeah.
And so given the name of your organization, what you're putting together, I'm going to make assumptions that you will resonate with that as a concept of just feeling disconnected from my own sense of place and people culturally, and really looking for more than a career path, but more of a deep connection to this path of empowering birthing people, right? To sort of understand that is the one thing that is inalienable right to us. And I think in terms of getting into the arc of my career, again, wasn't articulating it at 19, but was feeling it very much that there is this taboo conversation about the commodification of women's bodies, and that's several thousand years old. It is profane in its connection to what is sacred, right? This dichotomy of absolute, I don't think there's a better word than profane for what happens in terms of the transaction that centers around birthing people. And that this dance between a calling and a career like a calling to hear the outrage and stand with people who are going through this process that is transactional, starting and ending with insurance and paying my bill and what's going to cost me and how much that occupies us, to getting midwifery education and how will I become a midwife and how will that what is that going to cost me? And how far I get caught up in that cycle of commodification, of transaction, of this birth being transactional, and it's inherent. It's not, we think a lot about how many of the broken aspects, the truly broken aspects of maternal health being rooted in the transaction, but it really goes back further, I think, than just capitalism. It is a bigger process around ownership of our own bodies, right? And where that
yeah, there's such intersectionality there with patriarchy and racism and colonialism and like all the isms. Here we are, sexism. Yeah. Wow, that brilliantly said. And so take us through the leap from like essentially teenager fascinated by these midwives to now being the executive director of like the things you're doing.
So in that,
fill in the gaps.
Right. The journey was, I lived and still live in Virginia, and in Virginia in 1992. So there wasn't a whole lot of time between that teenager wanting to be a midwife and what I call my first big career move, which is the birth of my son in 1992. But in even that journey of having apprenticed with a midwife in Mississippi that Ina May connected me to, and sort of living with her for a little bit as at 20, and then, considering pathways to midwifery and feeling very blocked in Virginia. It would be, at that point, it was Seattle Midwifery School, like move. Concept of distance learning wasn't really there in any kind of tangible way. There were some, I'll just call them far out midwifery teachers at that point that, despite their being far out, they were expensive. And now looking back, were very much culturally appropriating various forms of traditional midwifery for middle-class white women who couldn't afford it, right? And I wasn't able to afford it, but I would have 100% done it if I could have, because I didn't really realize what I was looking at. Like, again, I speak to fetishizing of like, oh, I want that. I want to be a traditional midwife. That's what I want. Mm-hmm. So with the birth of my son in Virginia, where traditional midwifery was really non-existent, or if it existed, it was very underground and had been, and was in some ways even politically led by midwives who wanted to continue that type of practice of not being accountable to the system that commodifies our bodies. Totally understandable, yet sometimes we need that system. Sometimes we need those pieces, right? I'm going to try to just do sort of a blanket apology to my young self and my naivete. You're asking for a history of a person who has been on a journey of recognizing so much privilege and so much naivete in the simplicity of how the world works, right? So this very naive 20-year-old who wanted to believe that there is a path to reclaiming our traditional heritage as midwives and being able to be empowered. And so that person also owes apologies for that naivete and some of the work that was done along the way. And so just for context here, I can't tell the story without acknowledging that, and yet it breaks it up a bit, right? To be able to pause and say, well, my naivete at the time that I had my child, and I had 2 children born at home in Virginia when midwifery was illegal. And when I say midwifery was illegal, direct entry midwifery, as we called it then, nurse midwifery was legal and licensed. And my midwife with my first child was a nurse midwife. And that's a side story, but just her experience as a home birth practicing nurse midwife was to be utterly prosecuted and scrutinized by the Board of Nursing. Every single transfer was a complaint. And so I very much was aware of like, well, that's not going to work, to go and get a $50,000 degree and then just basically be run out of town by the licensing board. And also in my heart, I thought, I don't really want to be a nurse. I started nursing school twice and I was like, I don't want to be a nurse. I want to be a midwife. I just don't feel this resonant to the institutional framework of nursing. Appreciate nurses, appreciate them so much, but don't want to be one. Don't really see that as one. And that's maybe for some midwives who kind of try to get their nursing degree and then figure it out. But I really had the opportunity to learn from a nurse midwife who was unhappy and really struggling to do what she needed to do. So the process between 98 and 2006, when we finally got licensure passed, so again, another apology, was really built on the shoulders, backs of granny midwives who had been permitted through the Department of Health until 1978, when Medicaid came into effect in Virginia, and poor people and people of color could now have hospital births that were paid for. And the need for granny midwives was being phased out. And so, the some of it was Medicaid, some of it was nurse midwifery, that were both sort of being established at around that time in the late 70s. No new permits were issued to the permitted midwives who were permitted under the Department of Health. And they weren't exclusively Black, but they were mostly Black midwives who cared for their communities. When I say on the backs of that is that the process of getting the licensure done was to eliminate that law that was on the books recognizing permitted direct entry midwives, because the Department of Health had stopped implementing that law 20 years ago, but had allowed those midwives who held their permit, and that's why they were called granny midwives, is that they were grandmothered in to an outdated law. And so the last granny midwife stopped practicing. She was in her 90s in the early 90s. And it was her retirement that allowed us to then say, well, you're not going to issue any new permits, so you need to deprecate that law. It took us 6 years. And the only way, the short version of that story is we got the legislature through consumer movement to decriminalize midwifery for a minute. It's very similar to the cannabis laws in Virginia right now. It's a method that they've used. I wondered if, when they did that, I was like, I wonder if they used the midwifery strategy, which is we said, okay, if you don't want to license us, decriminalize it. Stop making it a misdemeanor or a felony practice of medicine. Just decriminalize it. And of course, what they did was decriminalize it with intent to regulate within the year. And so the following year, we got the licensure passed. So that whole journey for me was also my training time, where I finally had a CPM in Virginia who I could work with, and she became my midwifery partner. And by that, I was able to get my CPM. So I got a CPM the same year we got the licensure passed in Virginia. And so then moved into the regulatory process as I was becoming a brand new midwife. And that whole process was, I tell my kids about the Boston Tea Party and what civil disobedience is, and that mom might get in trouble, but somebody has to tell the legislators what a midwife looks like. And so I was the legislative liaison, which meant I'm up there testifying, saying, I am a midwife. This is what we look like. This is what we do. Let me explain the CPM. Let me explain what this is. So that was really very self-serving, so that I wouldn't go to jail, which was my 12-year-old's greatest desire, was to not see his mother arrested for the practice of midwifery. I'm like, I am going to do that, Max. That is what's going to happen here. And so when that bill passed in 2006, Ida Dara, who was the chair of NARM at the time, who we had brought to Virginia multiple times to help us with legislative, and Carol Nelson, who I had met through midwifery training, recruited me to come onto the NARM board. And I remember thinking, well, I owe it now to this baby I helped create in Virginia to help oversee. And I will say at that point, I also recognized that I think I was a very good midwife when I was practicing. I think I'm very good at meeting people with where they are and addressing that knowledge translation across cultures and identities. So in particular, when our clients needed to interface with a different culture, the medical system was very good at that process, and I did a lot of work on shared decision making and communicating the difference between giving your opinion and providing evidence, which is something I think midwives need a lot of help and work on. So in that, I felt, this is my obligation. And I spent 7 years on the NARM board, sort of, I have lots of feelings about my perceptions of then, what I understood and didn't understand about nonprofit organizations or businesses in general, because my only business experience was running my own midwifery practice. But in that practice, I had the great privilege of getting to go to one ICM conference in, actually, I ended up going to two. I went one on my own, but the one that I went for in support of NARM was in Durban, South Africa. And it was the conference when the definition of a midwife was being adopted by ICM. And I kind of have the whole backstory on why that happened, what that was about. But what that framework was around this concept of education, regulation, and association, these three pillars of a credential, of a profession. And a lot of things clicked for me then. And I will say that my concerns over the way in which all of the professional associations and organizations were interplaying with each other in a more competitive mode rather than a collaborative mode was very concerning to me. And I worked very hard, was very much part of some special projects, which is my title at NARM, to try to, it was the pre-work of US MERA. And then I was part of the initiation. I was on the steering committee to get US MERA to happen. So in that around dialogue, I left before the final agreements were made, because honestly, that wasn't what was important to me. What was important to me is that the dialogue structure could happen. And what I recognized even in that was that it was still, and this is my opinion about the state of the world right now with midwifery in the US, is that there was a need for fragmentation. The fragmentation that has happened now was necessary. And the attempt, again, naive, Brynne, we should unify. We should come together. We should get everybody in a room and try and have these conversations so that everybody's working at the same goal. Great idea. Except for what I witnessed and what I think still happens is that when we strive for unification, those people whose voices tend to be marginalized are even more marginalized in unified circles. And that the need for fragmentation has not happened because people were lazy or bored or didn't want to all come together. It is that in order to have a voice, you have to differentiate enough and that your voice is clearly heard and your needs are being clearly heard. And bringing everybody together without that differentiation was the same voices are heard over and over again. And the battles and the overpowering result is inevitable, that we were going to get a result that was built out of the largest voices always getting to speak. And so I left for two reasons. I left because I felt like I'm having impact because I can do a thing. And I'm not sure that that's actually what should happen right now, because what I see is a lot of harm in what I wouldn't call it a false unification, but it may be moving to unification too quickly when the fragmentation that is real is not being acknowledged and named and understood. But I'm giving myself way too much credit, because the other thing that I really left for was starting Maternity Neighborhood. And that
this is the next thing I wanted to hear about. You've done a real thing.
The need for Maternity Neighborhood really came out of the platform I was sitting at NARM. And so I acknowledge that privilege of being at NARM and seeing things from a higher perch.
Vantage point.
Thank you. I could then see this opportunity. And so like a deep part of I can bring this full circle back to the commodification issue. I feel a little bit, and I will say I'm a unicorn, but there are other unicorns, but it's rare to have midwives, want to talk about the money. We get really, really upset when we kind of have to talk about the money. B, talk about it enough to think, well, how are we going to solve for this? Because if we can't figure out two things. One, a way to get paid and have a sustainable midwifery practice, number one. But the underlying layer there is a way to be able to provide services to the people who want and need them requires that they can use their insurance or whatever resources they might have are reasonable, that it can't be that we are only providing midwifery care to people who can pay out of pocket, which is kind of the situation. And it was the situation 15 years ago. So maternity neighborhood was really two things. One is that we had the American Reinvestment Act that was funding digital records, right? Hey, we got to go digital. And because most electronic health records are built out of billing software, I had an awareness that billing is broken for midwifery because you don't get paid for doing a good job in midwifery care, the way with fee-for-service works. We have to come up with a better way. And from my vantage point, I was aware and studied value-based payment and just the concept that really came out of way before even Obamacare. It's back from the Clinton era, that this goes way back, this idea of bundled payment for value, and that this is exactly the payment model that midwifery should be holding out for and designing itself for in anticipation of these mechanisms to be able to plug into getting paid for providing a good outcome as opposed to a procedure or a chunk of time, which is how fee-for-service works. And so it's the perverse incentive is that, oh, I do less, I get paid less. I do more, I get paid more. I do more risky, I get paid more. I do less risky things, I get paid less. Breaking that out, the solution, short, whole other podcast, right? The short answer is value-based payment. And how do we value-based payment? We collect our data. We think about the juxtaposition between quality and accountability, which is really what I am on about. And we come up with structures to allow that to happen. Well, the first thing is we need to not be tied to an electronic health record that is solely focused on fee-for-service billing and only allows you to do anything that you can code and doesn't allow for processes of care to unfold. And so I didn't focus on billing, which was like a business mistake, but a philosophical imperative to our success is that, well, there's billing software and there's billing companies, and I'm not a billing person. I'm a process person. And I want to build a tool that tracks the processes of care that get to the good outcome so that we can understand those processes. And so the two big things, I have many things about maternity neighborhoods design that I'm proud of, but the big things were mother-baby dyad integrated into the chart, right? That you can care for mom and baby on the same screen, that it doesn't pop out and go somewhere else. Intrapartum transfer, the ability to compile a document that is relevant to the receiving provider and be able to be sent in a timely way. These are like important. Intermittent auscultation. What is it? Why are we doing these processes? Being able to track time in a way that is relevant to the story of home birth in particular, of labor starts not when the provider arrives, it starts when the mother starts labor. But in any electronic health record, nothing starts till the provider gets there. It's all provider-centered.
Right.
So just to utilize human-centered design to think about what could unfold. And I was lucky to partner with an engineer, developer, and a designer who were super excited to have basically one had been a home birth client, but generally knew nothing about midwifery and the process that would happen. And we had many long arguments around faxing and how we should just not do faxing. I'm like, tell me about it. We've got to figure out faxing because we're not getting rid of it. We can't. But just to be able to have that discussion of what does human-centered design mean? And that's how we started maternity neighborhood. Very simple, very, very like rudimentary. The biggest complaint people got is like, it doesn't do enough. Like, I love how it does this. I want it to do everything for me, including my laundry. Like, all well, why don't you do this well? And my dilemma that I hit very early on is, there's this little problem in that midwives don't get paid enough to pay me enough, to pay developers enough to really make it do all the things, including your laundry. I'd love for it to do all the things. But the back to the transaction isn't going to work. And I can't squeeze more money from you. I know you don't get paid well. So now I'm still at this place where I got to fix payment, even from a business perspective. So it kind of was like, my concern is that there will not be high quality products for midwives that are bespoke for midwives that really sustain if midwives aren't sustaining. And so this dilemma of how do we improve and how do we get better still keeps speaking back to how do we improve payment and what's the mechanism for doing that? and what's there and kind of what's the structure and what's missing. Because I feel like there's like this beautiful, I've often called it like a sports car, but the parts are kind of on the table and we're trying to put them together and say there's things that make this so unique and so valuable, in particular around U.S. midwifery. Sidebar, but kind of relevant to this, is that at one point through this arc of developing Maternity Neighborhood, long off the NARM board, I was invited. Somehow Maternity Neighborhood got on the radar of the World Health Organization's Maternal Child Health Division. And they were in a process of trying to identify apps, because it was sort of in this mode of like, there's an app, like we're going to build an app and it's going to solve every healthcare problem. And what
totally
there for maternal health. And I will say a lot of Maternity Neighborhood's early success was because there just wasn't much else. We won an Institute of Medicine Health Data Palooza, which was really funny because it was in the 2000s, that something from the 90s, that like classic, right? Of like, yeah, you're even your fun themed conference is outdated in its terms, but
right.
Not only were we the only maternal health app, we were the only women's health app at all.
Wow.
But we were top 50, like we got this accolade. And again, this allowing us to be tokenized as a way to move us forward. We weren't really all that great, but we were the only one there. And so we get the award and we get the attention and we get the claps on the back for existing. And I think that's often a parallel for midwives as well. It's like, congrats, you exist. Congrats. That's great. My joke was, and
we aren't tracking your stats. We aren't paying you enough. We have no investment in you, but well done, you.
Well done. Exactly. Yes. And that's kind of often like, I like the tagline for both Maternity Neighborhood and for midwifery is, we suck less.
Oh my God, you're killing me, but that's awesome.
This episode is brought to you by Lawnmower Bookkeeping, a virtual bookkeeping firm supporting midwives and doulas. We understand that what you love to do is serve mamas. But sometimes nothing takes you out of your zone of genius like thinking about the money. So while we focus on managing your books, you can focus on client care. By keeping your books clean and tidy, we can help you make confident money moves, pay yourself a consistent salary, proactively save for taxes, and plan for growth. Learn more about working with us by clicking the link in the show notes.
But it's true, like we compare ourselves to other things and say, but they're worse. Not at a point in I would say we haven't been until now at a point in which there's interest in our existence, right? When we say, who's congratulating us for existing? It's just self-congratulations. No one's actually saying, for the years that I've been working for midwifery, there have been very few external policymakers, politicians.
You can name them. You declare.
Exactly. We've got a little
Davis Floyd.
Right.
Like you can name them, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And so that is shifting now.
So there's USA Today articles and there's New York Times articles and there's Medium is doing these spreads on it. Like there is definite media attention.
Right.
And there are multiple studies now coming out, mostly it feels like in Australia, but there's lots of these studies coming out proving the value that we all talk about all the time. So there's definitely more interest for sure. Things are changing.
Right. And so that's one change, right? That there's external interest, and you could argue some of it is just time has come, but also is that we've tried everything else. And now we're going to come to you and say, and I would say the pandemic as well, of just this community birth. And I've really started adopting that community birth because it's inclusive of all credentials. It's, in general, back to the unification idealism. I think we're better off focusing on place of birth than in credential. Right.
That's what Midwifery Wisdom is all about. We focus on the location of care, not the provider type. Totally. And so we have MDs and we have nurses and we have CMs and we have all the people who do birth in the community-based space, doctors who own birth centers, venture capitalists who own birth centers. We're creating a space where everyone can focus on the location of care, because it is actually, that's the difference. There are no epidurals at home. It doesn't matter. there's no epidurals of birth center. Like it's a care model that is location specific. I love that you got that too.
Yeah, thinking about standards, thinking about like where we're heading. So external interest, we talked about that. That's one thing that's changed. The other is the CPM is going to be 30 years old this year, right? It's been 30 years now. And so what we know about everything that's 30 years or older is it's outdated, needs to change, needs to be updated, needs to have some self-reflection. It's like our Saturn return of the CPM.
I was going to be like, not a maiden anymore.
Exactly. Yes. It's time. And that what was relevant and what was the spark, what was needed to create a credential? Why did we need the credential? What was the credential intended to do? I don't know that we can really for sure answer the question of then, but we can look back and say, what did it do? What has it accomplished? What has it not accomplished? What can it accomplish? What can't it accomplish? Right? What are the purviews of a certification? Why do we have it? What is it? How is it serving the midwifery community? How is it not? All of these things are timely, because whatever the shifts that need to be made when you're shifting from your 20s to your 30s, if we use that analogy, it matters how we set ourselves up to do the next thing and what's there.
Yeah.
But I'll pause there because I got a lot to say on that, but I'll go back to just kind of bring to closure of like how I got here now, right? So neighborhood, built it out. It hit a plateau. It had good competition from other independent EHRs, and as well as what I would call sort of the more enterprise EHRs. So we have this like healthy mix of opportunities for midwives. I have the loyal following, but they're steady, right? There's not a big market to go get, right? There's not a whole lot. There's like, well,
there's only 15,000 midwives in the entire country.
Very few get to pick their own EHR anyway. So it's a reflection of, having done the apprenticeship MBA, I would call it, of maternity neighborhood. Like ROI, there was no return on investment directly for building new features. They were just like, hey, we've got some extra bandwidth, extra resource. Let's give this thing to say thank you, but we're not going to charge more, get more, or go get a bunch of more midwives for this one feature. We surveyed midwives up and down to try and see if there were consistent features that all midwives would want, and pretty much no. Pretty much not. You can't make anybody happy. And in fact, almost every feature made half of our customers unhappy and the other had happy. Yeah. It was almost 50-50. It wasn't even in trying to like segment them and figure out who wants what.
Such a burn.
No. What you find out is that midwives are the most freaking independent creatures you will come across in any cohort. They are just...
I think the other word for that is traumatized, but yes, independent is the outcome.
We can say this because we're midwives. We can say this about midwives, but it is definitely...
takes one to know one. Okay? So no judgment, no shame.
Only my last support person, I hired people who were not midwives to work with midwives. Sometimes we had midwives working with midwives, but only the last one that I had was the only one who never was brought to tears by a customer. But pretty much every customer support person hired, we had to kind of like go through little periods of time, like, let's just use email. Let's not talk to midwives because they're brutal. They can be so, especially because you answer the phone and want to help them. Like, well, let me tell you how outraged.
But they're in a state of such crisis themselves, like
all the empathy and understanding.
Right. And it's getting worse too.
Well, because the crisis is increasing. So the opportunity to have maternity neighborhood be acquired by Quilted Health came. There were a couple I'd actually really wanted to be acquired by a venture capital company because we were private equity, and the best exit, I had explored a few different exits. So I was definitely shopping for exit. Where can this baby land? Because it is teetering all the time, just like midwives are. So I think anyone listening to this say maternity neighborhood was just like your midwifery practice. You had good times and hard times. And when you think about what it would be if you stop practicing, what happens when those clients call you, That's what I was dealing with maternity neighborhood. We had tried the configuration. We got it down to 5 people. It was sustain and waiting. And another metaphor I often use, like, we're just on a desert island, but we had coconuts, right? Like, we were going to be there, but there was nothing going to be other than coconuts happening unless some ship came and picked us up. And that was Quilted Health. That there were several acquisition attempts over the years with maternity neighborhood. And the reasons each of them didn't go are varied and vast. And will be an interesting book someday when I think about like how private equity looked at maternity neighborhood and what was challenging, what was good, like positioning yourself to want someone to date you. But then I don't even know if I want to date you. I just want you to want to date me was kind of life with maternity neighborhood. I want to be desired.
Yeah, I get it.
Leave me alone. I don't really want to spend my time wondering what you think of me all the time. I want to just be.
Sounds like you were right in alignment with the culture. Because that isn't it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want the right clients that come to me. I don't want to tell people I'm something I'm not. And yet I want me as their midwife. Absolutely. And that was true of my customers. I want them to want us. But we got into a sales practice that some midwives will recognize where we just say, I'm not sure if this is right for you. Just like
it's called negative copy.
Exactly.
Negative copy works really well.
Around at some other options because I don't want any more unhappy customers. I really only want the ones like I get it. I feel like it's fair. It's fine. Yes. Hopefully, and so all of us, including the customers, I think have been very excited about, Quilted Health, we're going to get this going. And I think there's still a lot of good hope for that. My journey working for Quilted Health and being there had to come to an end, just to say I was there for 18 months, learned a lot more. And the biggest thing that I was involved in was incubating this concept of a clinically integrated network. That was sort of
so that's what I was going to say. Could you go back a second and just, I'm not sure everyone knows what Quilted Health is. And I think it's got a big future and a lot of things happening. So will you kind of describe that and then tell us what you did for it?
Yeah. So Quilted Health is a private equity funded startup that started based in Seattle, Washington. What makes, I know people know there's the background on like what is private equity and all of that, but essentially it has investors that have put in money with the goal of centering midwifery as a solution for improving maternal health outcomes.
Right.
They have, like maternity neighborhoods, are similarly structured, but at a different level, both in the amount of funding, but also who their investors were. Where I had what are called angel investors, which would be like independent, high net worth individuals who are really interested in the concept, but I did not have any what's called venture capital, which would be funds, like collections of funds that are sort of managed by entities. So if you have money, you can invest directly, or you can put your money into a fund. And then that fund, it's not the same as a hedge fund or a mutual fund, but it's basically this idea. So for example, there is a healthcare system, a hospital system in Washington State called Multicare. And Multicare has a investment entity that is associated with it, invests on behalf of the hospital system in startups that they think would be really beneficial to exist and utilize for their own benefit, to say, I want this business. And so Multicare is an investor in Quilted, as well as Blue Cross Blue Shield. They're overarching, they represent, their investor of the Blue Venture Fund, I think represents 25 independent Blue Cross Blue Shield organizations across the country. So you think about those kinds of investors. Number one, it's sort of, scary to think about payers being investors in midwifery, because you think, well, where is that alignment? And also thinking about the arc of time, and that over the next 10 years, or if we look at the past 10 years and the next 10 years, we are going to see investors from all directions investing in midwifery, because they're waking up, as we said, to, hey, we need to think about a solution and nothing else has worked. We've tried, preventing preterm birth with a drug or with a procedure or with that, and it's not happening. Maybe we could use, I often say relationship is the prescription. And what's the dosage and delivery route? And like, who's the best at delivering relationship as part of care? Midwives.
Culturally matched midwives.
So with that, they're getting it, and investing in it. But again, looking at it in a structure and format that is sort of in its own paradox of capitalism. So the sort of feelings are fair and valid to say, yeah, but at the end of the day, you have investors that want you to make a return on investment. And at the end of the day, that's true for maternity neighborhood. So where maternity neighborhood and quilted were very aligned, maternity neighborhood and quilted and the midwifery community have more work to do to really understand the difference between being a business that supports a community and, let's say, a nonprofit or a group. I'm not sure what your legal structure is, but an entity that's like, no, our purpose is this community. And in this, NARM's purpose is this community, right? There are organizations that fully are embedded, but a for-profit company like Maternity Neighborhood that had private investors or Quilted is really both. In order to make the profit that they're promising their investors, they have to invest in the community. But that's the dance, and that's where the sort of questions come.
Yeah, this is this concept around social entrepreneurialism, where it's like sort of a hybridism.
It's experimental in that it's the alternative to take down the system, which is really a hard one too. There's lists of things you do that. This is sort of would be more of a, trying to infiltrate, trying to kind of acknowledge that there are elements. So what Quilted is, so that's kind of their background, but what they are, what they've been doing, they opened clinics in Washington. They've explored independent midwifery. They've pursued a lot of different avenues in their 4 years of existence. And one of those was acquiring Maternity Neighborhood, both to have embedded technology as part of their business model, because that's a really good idea. And what we really incubated with, the challenge of Maternity Neighborhood from an investment perspective is it's 350 independent practices. A little hard to kind of marry that to a lot of other business models where you're not going to compete with those other businesses. You're going to actually elevate those other businesses. And so we created both a challenge and a benefit in that. Wow, you have an active customer base of people leaning in. What can you offer everybody that's going to benefit everybody and set you apart? And that's really where this concept of a clinically integrated network that Quilted, and also that sort of, we did a lot of that. What can Quilted offer in this story? And you've got more than just me, but you definitely had me and others like me that had the ear of Quilted to kind of envision what can and can't you do with this group of people, where these midwives are in their evolution as a profession, what's needed. And that sort of track of trying to understand what would be necessary to have Quilted come in and succeed as a clinically integrated network for community-based midwives became my role at Quilted. I was VP of community. So I started out still running Maternity Neighborhood for the first little bit, got there, we kept running in parallel. And then over time, gratefully let people with more expertise and experience in some of the things that I was managing take over. And so kind of shifted out of the technology side of Quilted and really moved into the community side of Quilted, which was its own journey. It's like watching your child grow, and go and, nail biting, but also accepting this is the process that not everybody gets. What a great gift that I got to get to be acquired and have this, that's the goal, is to be able to do that and then see it move into something. And then think about its potential and what could we do to set the table. And then I feel a little bit like I'm ambassador for Quilted when I was at Quilted. And now that I've shifted into being NARM, I'm a little bit ambassador for Quilted and entities like Quilted to say, okay, welcome to the world of community birth. Don't look in these closets here, if you don't mind. We're just going to we're going to have a party on the patio. We're just going to not invite all the way in because we have been struggling over here in the community birth world. Guess what? That's great that you now want to come to our party or invite us to yours, but we have been outside without, resources for a really long time. And
no spring cleaning has been done.
That thought of wanting to sit together at a table and let the midwifery community have an opportunity to first just look around. And for me, and I'm speaking about me when I say midwifery community, my experience of having been at Maternity Neighborhood, stop practicing. I let my CPM go. I don't want to go to births anymore unless they're like my friends and I'm their doula, but really just grieve that part and say, I am here as maybe a midwife to midwifery, right? I'm here to bring these unique perspectives that I've had in running a fairly successful business and then working for a successful business to say, oh, there's a lot there that if we're trying to in any way integrate with the system that we collectively, culturally either don't understand or don't approve of, don't even engage in, but we're missing huge opportunities because we're not paying attention to things that are happening. And then we're like, wait, what's that?
Yeah.
Tima, that was what Tima opportunity. So within that, my move to come to NARM was because I knew from 15 years ago being on the NARM board that the board is a working board and that organizationally there were some transitions that had needed to happen a while ago that hadn't happened. That when NARM reached out, a couple members of the board reached out to ask if I would help them with trying to hire an executive director. Mm-hmm. And I was like, you guys are going to hire a real executive director. That's great. Do you have a job description? Do you have, what are you going to have them do? What are you not going to have them do? And they were like, yeah, help us figure that out. And so in the process of helping them figure it out and getting into it and sort of seeing where things were, it was like suddenly this door opened for me of like, I've been looking for the step out to retirement, like the actual exit for me to sort of, maybe we know there needs to be lots of books written for midwifery. Like, can I have like a different experience that's not quite, holding it day to day?
Yeah.
But somehow coming and helping NARM in this phase of transitioning NARM into the business it's always needed to be with a different...
Yeah, also in the 21st century.
Just really realizing there is so much here. And now from my sitting at the seat at Quilted and thinking, it's so important that this credential be evaluated and be brought into modern times, that it successfully go through its Saturn return, that it get an opportunity to, what does it want to be? And what's missing and what isn't it, right? That can then create.
And who is it to other people?
Absolutely.
This relational piece, because it means such different things to different people. It's not understood,
It's meeting different needs for different people. It's not necessarily getting the same thing. Like if you look at Florida or California, where you need the CPM exam to get a license, but you don't need to be a CPM, versus Virginia, where you need to be a CPM to be licensed and you need to stay a CPM. So even the varied history of the creation of the credential as its relationship to licensure has become more fragmented than it was 15 years ago. We have fewer licensed midwives becoming CPMs because they don't need to be CPMs, because what's the value? And just being able to step back and ask, is the CPM fulfilling its potential of what its value is? And does it need to be more than it is? And as that clarity of sense of emerging, saying, this is what it is and this is what it isn't, it makes space for those isn'ts to become things, right? And I have lots of ideas around, way too many, around what could be and how things could look. And I think we are at a point where if we're going to take advantage of things like TIMA, with the transforming maternity initiatives that are coming from the federal Medicaid that are going to impact and drive how midwifery is positioned in the states for the next 10 to 20 years. And right now, the midwifery, the community birth community, who is community? What does it mean? Who are we? Are definitely not unified, but not even acknowledging the fragmentation in a way that can be productive, right? So we're just going to see the continued fragmentation. And in a sense, the CPM is one of the few unifiers that has potential, right? It's something that there can be a number of people who put this behind their name and it means something. And because it has become so fragmented, even the CPM now becomes, do you want to be a CPM or do you not want to be a CPM? And maybe there's a reason why you do or don't. But we have this moment, I think, and that's really why I made this step to move from Quilted to NARM, is to say, I think I have perspective and I have energy to help ask the question, not necessarily decide how it's going to be. I don't think that's my role, but to begin to engage the community as well as NARM itself into why do we do it this way? Like, that fresh perspective, while also I've been there before and I sort of have some familiarity. Yeah. And so that's why I was looking at this ED role and saying, gosh, I think I might be the only person who could be qualified to do this, that I have a unique set of skills in which I can hold this, what I kind of see as like just a few years, like an interim phase.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is going to be around, really developing a team of staff and work for NARM that can really be the future of what we can hold and sort of running it in a way that can enable more dialogue and engagement.
Well, can I just ask candidly, like, is there a budget for that?
I'm going to make sure there is. Yeah. I mean, NARM collects money, right? NARM collects money for.
They do indeed.
Come in.
And they're not super transparent about what they're doing with the money.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Saving it has been mostly it. So yes. So yes, there is. And that is what we need to do. Like, even if there's not a budget for that, if there isn't the money, we need to get the money, because that's what needs to happen.
Yeah.
Right. That NARM is not a member organization. And so it doesn't have a representative board, yet it has very energetic people that have really dedicated a lot to NARM who are ready to retire. They're making their plans like that. And it needs to happen. And that feeling of like, oh, I've held on to this. How do I transition it? And it's both things. I told the NARM board when I was coming on, I said, look, in order for me to come here, I have to let go of my baby. I have to let go of any neighborhood. I have empathy for you of what it's going to feel like to let go, not only of being on this board or having the position that you've had, but also it's going to change. It's going to change. It's not going to look like it has. And so will maternity.
It can't survive, actually. It can't survive and look the same. Yeah.
It will not look. Yep.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I was really excited when I heard that you took this position, because I feel the same way. I couldn't think of anyone else who was as qualified to sit in the balance between what needs to happen, what hasn't happened, what could happen, and really ask those questions. Like you said, you're obviously an incredibly curious human. That's how you've gotten to all these places. It's like, so I felt like it was awesome. But before we say goodbye tonight, I want to go into like how this place where you started, there is a commoditization of the student midwifery journey.
Yep.
And there's a huge amount of gatekeeping. And in the NARM process as well, there's a huge amount of hazing and abuse. And I guess this isn't new to you. You're aware, you're in the world, you see the chat forums. You may not have an answer yet, but like, given that I think those of us who've been, 20, 30 years, we're starting to be like, oh, I see my younger self and all those things, right? Like you were describing. How do we find a way out at the same time acknowledging that these organizations are also maybe our only savior?
Yep.
Like how do we make sense of that? Because like if we lose NARM, like we've just lost MANA, CPM is gone. It's done.
Right.
Like there's no coming back from it, which means community-based birth is gone probably in the United States.
Right. Well, sure.
I mean, home birth probably likely. Birth center birth might stick around because of the ACNM involvement, but like mostly what we know as apprentice-based midwifery would be gone. And at the same time, the commoditization makes it so challenging and makes it so, I don't know, gross. Is that a word? Like
profane.
Like,
I think.
How do we make sense of that? Profane is your word. Yes. So how do you make sense of this in your brain? Because you're a real critical thinker here.
Right. I would say stay tuned. Because that's that you just articulated the primary question, right? Like great question. The first step, so I can say, I've been the NARM ED now for about 2 months. And big changes have already happened and more big changes are coming. So there's certain things that were just like really big. We've just got to change certain systems. And so just even setting up, like this week, we're setting up a ticketing system so that all correspondence comes to one place and it's held by staff and it's answered, and we save tickets, and I start to get reports on what are people's questions, what are people experiencing, what's happening, just more data on what's actually happening. And that would be my answer to almost every concern that gets leveled at NARM and the CPM is we are going to be transparent about data. We are going to start tracking everything and clarify and kind of bring the question to that place. So the first thing is, what are the immovable objects in relation to maintaining an accredited credential? And just like we could do a whole talk around what the ICM standards for education, regulation, and association are, we're the R. NARM is regulation. That is where NARM sits. And kind of like, I kind of see it as like one of those, like you start out at this, looking at the planet and then zoom in and zoom in and zoom in, like the Google Maps, zooming experience where suddenly you're down to a point where you say the big zoom is we're regulation, like that's the component with that we are, and we have to be in relationship to the E, which is education, MEEK, and association. Manna just went away. Manna created NARM, values, ethics, overarching core competencies. Those were all held as they should be by the association. That's missing right now. And there is a process that needs to unfold in which is NACPM the natural ascending?
Yeah, so I was going to ask, what about NACPM?
What about all the fragmented associations that CPMs join?
State level.
Or national level. There's Birth Center Equity, there's National Black Midwives Alliance. There are associations CPMs join, AABC, where they get represented voice, but they are not connected to the CPM in our ERA. That's one problem. It's just like, how do we get all the voices of CPMs engaged? The next is test development and having a test and having an exam that is equitable when the original test was written by the majority of CPMs, and who are the majority of CPMs and who are they caring for? And so this changing world questions this process that exists and is accredited to ensure that it's two things. Some of those processes exist because they're built within white supremacist culture. They exist to maintain a status quo. And that's part of accreditation. It's part of our rule. Part of why we exist is maintaining status quo. But we need to name it, just like we're not saying, oh, there's this money part I don't really like about midwifery. Well, there's this status quo part that I don't like about certification, but we got to name it and make sure everybody understands it and says, we can adjust this, but we have to be very careful. Because if we lose our accreditation, that becomes then the whole line to licensure and legal practice. And so be careful. But within those fine threads, what can we do? What is movable? What is achievable with engagement and creative thinkers and smart people who I know have been thinking about this and said, gosh, if only we were in a moment where NARM and everyone was in a self-reflective moment and say, hey, can we all be self-reflective? Back to my, can we all just get in a room and work this out? Yes. And who goes in the room? And what's the power dynamic? And that was the lesson from before, is like, well, there's got to be this minute where we ask, how are we going to have this dialogue? Is it a battle? Is it a collaborative effort? Is it representative? So my job is to get smart really fast on test development, accreditation, some of these things that I peripherally understood but have not deeply understood. And then I need to translate that and articulate that to those of you who want to participate in a dialogue around what can be done here and how and when, and basically develop it, which is already what I'm doing internally for NARM, but to develop an external roadmap. And part of that roadmap includes my departure, because one of the things we have to talk about is succession, and that we need to begin with our end in mind individually for this to sustain.
Yes.
So you will not be talking to me in 30 years. I promise you, unless another topic. It is going to be 2 to 5 years, me changing my role and allowing a representative board and process to really think about leadership and think about succession before we start. So I forgive, but that's just my prerogative to forgive. I forgive the founders of NARM for not setting up succession as part of its organizational structure, but it caused big problems later on, in that we just don't know how to get over. We don't know how to make change because we haven't practiced.
I know. Founderitis is really dangerous, right? Yeah.
Well, we've been in a mode in which we've been in battle, so we don't really think about things when you're in battle. And the founders of NARM and the founders of MANA were in battle for their entire careers, have been in battle.
Yeah.
And we have this moment. We can keep being in battle. I think it's great to be a warrior. I have all the swords and tools here. If I need to go to battle for midwives, I will. I don't want to. I want a peaceful resolution here in which we get to exist and we can focus on healthy outcomes, which is what I'd love to talk about another time, is just like quality. And there are so many pieces. So test development is just one element, right? They're multifaceted. So a lot of it is that you're going to see me engaging and trying to educate as I learn. Learning in public is the phrase I like to talk about. It's like, let's all learn together. And we can point fingers. I'm happy to take my own hit around mistakes I make. I will make more for sure. Yeah, so
we all do.
Thank God I learned this lesson. I thought it was this, and then I realized it wasn't the right thing to do. So I changed. And so resiliency and humility, vulnerability, those are, I think, what you're going to start seeing from me, at least at NARM. And will that change just by having an ED who's saying, I don't know, guys, I think this is messed up. We got to fix it. What do you think, Augustine? How should we fix it?
I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah.
That's what I think. I can't think of a better place to start than that place of humility and asking questions and community involvement, because who would know better than those who are in it?
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
Yes. I applaud this effort. Such a pleasure to hear from you.
Absolutely.
Such a wealth of information. You're such a live wire, Brynne.
No, I definitely, I'm excited.
I ran into one of your past colleagues, Parveen Kelly, and she was just raving about you, and just really look forward to chatting to you. So thank you.
Yeah.
I hope we get to do it again. And gosh, I want NARM to be so much of what you just described. I'm here for it. If there's anything Midwifery Wisdom can do to support that transition, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Will do. Absolutely. All right. Take care.
Thanks, friend. Have a great day.
You too.